Hi everyone, and welcome to your Anaerobic Assessment Lab. Today is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to get to cover what maximal effort exercise looks like, and we'll get to dive into what energy system that uses, and more importantly, what that looks like when it comes to performance and performance of using anaerobic system. So again, we're going to start off. There's two systems: the aerobic and anaerobic, and ana essentially means no. So when we're looking at the anaerobic system, essentially you don't have time for oxygen and oxidative metabolism in one sense, and so we're simply going to be looking at no oxygen energy production. Remember, metabolism from your previous labs is essentially when you take food, energy of some sort, and convert it into energy or ATP that your body can use in a nutshell. Okay. And why do we not have enough time for oxygen? Well, essentially because we're doing maximum effort, the exercise that is utilizing as much force production as you can. And so again, we'll take a look at what that looks like to do with your physiology. And last but not least, we get into the assessment part. So you'll have a few activities to do on your own, but in principle, they're going to be very similar to what the gold standard is, which is the Wingate test, which is done on a bike, and you crank away, and you'll have some calculations and stuff to do with that. But first, let's take a look at your anaerobic system. So again, there's no oxygen, maximum effort. How does that play into the overall energy use and production in our bodies? Well, we'll take a look at what energy systems we have and what's contributing. This is kind of a classic the slide here with the three different energy systems that our body uses, and the first one is the ATP PC, or adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system, and really that kind of takes up the first 10 seconds of energy production when you're exercising, or if you're putting out a maximum effort. Again, anaerobic is max effort, or the very first part of a maximum effort, followed by the glycolytic. You can see here in the yellow, after we tap our phosphagen system, this is a kind of a relative amount of energy that we can get from that bout. So we can see we get a whole bunch more, or quite a bit more than, say, the glycolytic. So that's our next step system that will give us the most energy as we're trying to perform exercise. And again, that's the most ATP while we're trying to go with a full out effort. And then that gives way to our aerobic system. And so that's anything after about 90 seconds. Now you might see some contention between what range does the glycolytic system come into play. Some people are saying 60 seconds. Some say 2 minutes, maybe even a little bit more. I'm using 90 seconds in my example. And ultimately, it comes down to trainability. And that's something we're going to explore today, and you will in your lab activities to do with this lab. So just to clarify, again, ATP, PC, and the glycolytic system, they're both anaerobic, so they both don't use oxygen to produce energy. The aerobic does, and that's an important thing to remember as we move forward. So when are we doing anaerobic work? It's kind of hard to tell. Again, if you notice, we'll be going back and forth a bit here. If you notice, all our energy systems seem to overlap a little bit, right? We kind of have the phosphagen system, or ATP-PC, flowing into the anaerobic, which flows into the aerobic. But if you look here, the aerobic system is working the entire time. It's not like it's producing zero energy. It's just not enough to meet the demand. For example, if we're going maximal effort, really this is going to give us the best effort. Unfortunately, it's like a turbo boost, or in a car or something like that, where you just get a little nitrous boost and that's it. You're done. So that's all you're allowed to get. Once it's spent, it's spent. It's like burning a match. You don't get that back, really. And then we need to find another load of ATP from some sort of a system. We default to the glycogen, okay? And so again, this isn't max efforts. And while we're doing maximum efforts as far as physical activity, what that demands from our bodies is type 2 muscle fibers. Now again, thinking way back to the start of the semester where we're talking about muscle and muscle types. For the purpose of this course, you have two types. You have fast twitch and slow twitch. And fast twitch is that force production, the ones that the muscle fibers that are going to give you maximum force, as that comes back to your type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers. And so maximum, when you're thinking weightlifting here, you're thinking maybe a full out 100-meter sprint. These are going to be maximum force activities that are going to demand a lot of type 2 muscle fibers. Stereotypically, again, when we're thinking about anaerobic work, you can come up against something called your anaerobic threshold. And so this concept I like to put out there early on because it helps you realize that even if you happen to be exercising for a long time, if the intensity is low, when you pick up that intensity, you can run into the anaerobic threshold, which is like the red line in your car. So if you ever look at your car, you see how many RPMs or revs per minute that the engine's going. You'll have that on your dash somewhere, and when you reach a certain RPM that gets dangerous for the vehicle, it's going to be indicated by red numbers. So if you redline it, you get close to or above that line, it's hard on the engine. It's too much of the velocity, the heat that speed produces within the engine. It can cause damage and permanent damage, so much so that you can't fix it until after you stop the vehicle and take it to a repair shop, sort of thing. So how does that apply to you and your own anaerobic threshold? Well, it's kind of similar. If you're running a race and you hit this red line and you start going over, you have very limited time there, going back to this. So if you notice on the slide here, critical point with the T is a threshold, right? So we have our ATP storage. So within that 2 seconds, it runs out though. It's free floating, but there's not a lot of it there. So again, we need to move into our phosphocreatine and our anaerobic systems. But each of these have their own thresholds too, where they start getting depleted, and it's hard to replenish unless we rest. Okay, so when you think of that car redlining, you go over, burning out the engine, like revving away, you're not going to be able to fix that engine until you stop. Same thing with your body. Once you stop or slow down back past that threshold enough, your body can, when these energy systems can start producing energy again. Okay, we'll come back to that concept a little bit later, especially when we get to aerobic systems. But yeah, so here, this is our anaerobic system. That's our anaerobic threshold right there. And from that point on, it's just hard to produce any energy up to this level. We kind of get stuck with an energy production system that's quite low. But we'll learn that that's okay. But again, crossing that threshold, we do lots of work here. All of a sudden our effort level comes up. We have to cross that threshold, and we only have a little bit of time before we're kicked back into the aerobic system. Okay. And so why is this important when we're talking about anaerobic work? Again, the idea, there's a lot of analogies, and I think when you're first getting familiar with this idea of what system is doing how much work when. Okay, so if I'm working for 10 seconds really lightly, if I'm just strolling and going for a slow walk for 10 seconds, do I already use up my anaerobic systems? No, right? So it has to do with that effort level as well. So try to keep that in mind when you see graphs like this. You're talking about maximum amount of energy that can be produced, right? And in particular with anaerobic work, you're usually talking about a full out effort or very close to. So keeping this in mind, we got these energy systems: max force production, type 2 muscle fibers, anaerobic threshold. You hit this threshold. Why? What's happening at that threshold? Why is it we can produce a whole bunch of energy, typically laying around the cell, that we just utilize, and then some of it we can produce pretty quickly, but then what happens? Something happens where we can't use that anymore. And so that comes down to essentially a backup of waste. Okay, so we create too much waste from this production. Okay, here's kind of a place where we can start looking at this. So again, big flow chart, lots of, it's a biochemical pathway. You don't need to memorize it all. Luckily, we have a little cartoon on here that's going to help ease us into it. But ultimately, the take home here, again, is trying to focus on what sort of energy we can get without oxygen, and why does that run out for us, and what happens with that system to a certain extent. Okay, and in this case, we're going to be looking at the extra waste products that backlog the system. Okay, so you can think of this as a little bit of a like part of a factory. Okay, and this factory is the conveyor belt, and this first part of the conveyor belt, this glycolytic part, it can move really fast. So this part can move really, really fast. The part that can't, that moves slow, this is your oxidative system, so with oxygen. So your aerobic system. This is slow. This is slow moving conveyor belt. If you've ever seen, what's the movie? So it's got the cartoon animals in it, and Zootopia or something like that. And it's got the sloth at the DMV or the whatever, just super slow moving. That's the character we have operating your oxidative system. Okay, very, very slow. So what happens is this our glycolytic system backlogs with its waste products. It makes ATP, but something else that gets dumped out from this is something called pyruvate, and that's a byproduct essentially of making energy. Now, what happens with the pyruvate, you can see our fella here, our little critter. In this case, we got him like a Pac-Man sort of guy. If you don't have any oxygen, which, getting enough oxygen for huge energy production within 10 seconds, a minute, to get to all your cells. Just think of air getting into your lungs, from your lungs, into your blood, from your blood, out to the working muscles. Then from there, it has to get into the cell. Then once it's in the cell, it has to get converted through this pathway here with energy and oxygen. Remember that formula that I keep bringing up every time? Food plus oxygen equals energy and carbon dioxide and water. And so, but ultimately, that's what's happening here, right? So oxygen gets in your cell. We have food, in this case, glucose, which is a primary starting point for most of it, and for high intense activities, anaerobic activities, and there's not enough time to grab some oxygen and start making ATP. You needed that way back at the start of my yammering. You don't need it now, and you needed a lot of it. And if you think of in a ancient hominid sort of sense, where if we as Homo sapiens were getting chased in the grasslands by some sort of a creature, you have to run now. You can't wait, right? And you got to run fast. So again, it's a bit of a time thing. So no oxygen, it's too fast, so you just keep churning out, but you back up. And the pyruvate then essentially has to deal with something, and the thing it has to deal with is a hydrogen proton. And so what it does is it hands it off. Okay, it's kind of, you can think of it as a sponge almost, to try to accept this proton, so that one of the reactions can make ATP. So it does that, and then now that it kind of hands it off to more or less lactate. Okay, and we've all heard of lactic acid, right? And we're getting there. But lactate essentially is a molecule. Again, it's almost like a second sponge. You got a series of sponges, or it's almost like playing hot potato. You got pyruvate picks up the proton, then it hands it off to lactate, which turns into lactic acid, and then that it actually even shuttles it off into bicarbonate, which is in your blood. So you have this buffer system for acid and pH levels in your blood, or the lactic acid is converted into energy itself in the liver. So there's a few different things that can go on there, but really the take home is this pass along system of waste. Now what happens is when you get too many protons, is all the sponges are taken up. There's no more room. So you start getting acidotic. You might have heard that term, which means, your blood starts getting the pH levels in your cells drop. So that means they get to a smaller pH number, which means they actually get more acidic. And a whole bunch of things can happen in that case. One of which is you start hurting. Your muscles start really hurting. And the second one is you become weaker. Okay? So, a lot of people look at lactic acid and lactate and kind of point their fingers at, if you have lots of, you measure, the original study looked at, okay, well, as you go through intense exercise, and you start slowing down, there's this accumulation of lactic acid. So logic at the time was it's lactic acid that's a problem. The more you have of it, the slower you're going to be, the less you can perform in sport. But what we're coming to realize is that lactic acid is actually just something that is there because it's trying to help. It's actually the hydrogen protons that cause a lot of the issues. Okay. So again, then you get into a state of something called acidosis. And we have this great transparent person that's going to have a nice diagram for us to show us all the different things that can happen when our body and our cells get into a bit of a low pH state or acidosis. You can see a lot of things: headaches, sleepiness, confusion, loss of consciousness, shortness of breath, coughing. Muscular, you get seizures and weakness. Your heart can have an increased heart rate. And a lot of that is to help try to breathe out and get rid of your backed up pH systems in your blood. And also your gastric, you feel nauseous and you can vomit. And the reason I'm pointing out these things is this will actually happen. This can happen when you do your anaerobic assessments. In particular, with clients or yourself or whomever. So if you have an individual that is not used to training at higher intensities, very often you get people saying, oh yeah, I felt very queasy, I wanted to throw up. This has happened in the lab before, where students will participate in a Wingate test, which I'll tell you about in a second. They give all this out effort, they feel great, and then all of a sudden that backlog, there's a flood essentially of those protons that are backed up that finally start hitting your system. They start getting into your blood, and you start feeling nauseous. You have a receptor in your artery that can sense a change in pH. And that gives you a very nauseous, kind of sick, not so good feeling. So people, when they finish these tests, they might be okay for 2 minutes. But you get to 3-4 minutes after maybe, and all of a sudden, they look very sick. They need to lay down. We almost had one student pass out before, and you'll just see the color in their faces change. They'll stop speaking, and fortunately, there's someone there to help catch the person's head and lower them down to the ground safely. But otherwise, they could have just passed out and potentially hurt themselves. So it's really important to be very aware of those sorts of things. Okay, and again, just to reiterate, it comes from a backup of this energy system and hydrogen protons. Essentially, there's not enough sponges to soak up the hydrogen protons, which causes shift in pH in the rest of our body. Okay. So last but not least, I wanted to show you what a Wingate is, briefly talk about it, and then you'll get to do it yourself. Again, the validity of these tests typically comes from the capacity of a person to be able to produce a maximum effort. Okay? You don't necessarily get a very true reading or data if the person isn't pushing to their maximum. Okay, so I'm gonna hit play. Hopefully the sound isn't too loud. We'll watch one with sound. And so again, this is always a very exciting day in lab or when you're doing team assessments and stuff.
She's going to go off of you, so she'll watch you sprint. When you looks like you're getting real close to your top speed, she'll say, ready, set, go. Then you'll know.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you know what did they start at? 146? Okay.
And you'll notice they get quite loud, they cheer quite a bit, and that's right in the Wingate protocol. You by necessity need to cheer loudly. And it really does make a difference. If you do Wingate in a very quiet room as a participant, you definitely do not get the same results as you do in a room with lots of people cheering. So.
Ready? All right, go.
So it is dropped. So when she said go, this weight dropped onto the wheel and added resistance. Getting the whole body in there. Very important to stay seated. When you hear that, when you're doing this, you get to about 15 seconds, and you think in your mind, you're like, oh, I'm almost done, because time seems to slow down, and you hear something like, oh, 15 seconds or 10 seconds left. And you think in your head, you're just like, there's no way. There's no, this sounds terrible because you've already expended so much of your effort and so much of your energy.
Come on, let's go, George, let's go. All the way through, all the way through, all the way through. Nice job.
Pedaling with his upper body there on that one. Yeah.
I see you.
So yeah, again, we'll just kind of keep an eye on this fellow. You notice sits down right away. Very important, because again, things don't really hit you until a little bit later, and then you don't really know it. So it's really, really important when you're doing anaerobic assessments, when people are going to maximum efforts, that you don't let them out of your sight. It's a really important safety thing. Okay. Yeah, and you'll notice one of the points that I wanted to make about that too is one of the critiques about Wingates is efficiency. So someone who's ridden a bike a lot will have a more efficient pedal stroke than, say, our last participant there that did their Wingate test, where his whole upper body was like working hard, trying to keep pedal pressure going, trying to keep the wheels going, but losing and expending a lot of energy other places. So again, while this is a gold standard means essentially the test that all other tests are compared to. It's by no means perfect. So again, just as a safety warning for when you do anaerobic labs yourself as a participant or are watching someone, it becomes really, really important to keep in mind that when you do these max efforts, safety is really important. Always have someone there that can get help if needed, can guide, like if even needed more, guide your head down to the ground if you're not sitting when you start to not feel so good. And really take care of yourself and whomever you're training with. Occasionally, like some of these participants in particular, people who train fairly intensity, do a lot of interval work. They'll feel it, but they'll know how to handle it and deal with their bodies. But that's not the case for everyone, in particular if you're new to activity. So I think we'll just end with this last test here. And so lots of cheering. So you can notice some differences already between the first person and this person. This participant's smiling at the camera, the other person wasn't. So again, the validity behind a max effort comes into question a little bit. So I know from personal experience, if I'm giving a max effort on exercise, you don't feel like smiling too often. You're pretty in the thick of it. But also take a note of pedal speed.
10 seconds, 10 seconds, keep going, keep going.
10-second call.
5 seconds, all the way through, keep going. Nice job.
Right. Yeah, and so you can notice the difference between the two. Hopefully, both near the start and the end of the test, you notice how the rate of the pedaling changed, right? Our first participant happened really, really quick, slowed way down, right, towards the end. Our second participant here, they rode pretty quick, but then settled into a bit of a pace. And so if you think back to the beginning of this lecture, again, when you're talking about anaerobic efforts, that's maximum efforts. And what happens when you run out of that anaerobic space? You dip into aerobic, right? So if you remember that graph of 3, different energy systems, right? So I would suspect, if you're talking about energy systems, our last participant there, she was able to dip into the anaerobic for a bit at the start, but quickly got booted back into aerobic and just went into steady state pace. Okay. So again, lots you can glean from these Wingate tests and anaerobic tests, and they're always a blast. They're fun to do and try because you get to see where you're at as far as your capacity, and it's fun testing the body and seeing where you can what sort of efforts you can put out. Okay, so enjoy this week's labs and playing around with the anaerobic systems. Okay, bye.